Hello, this is Adam Carroll. Welcome to UN This Week. And we have an interesting guest today, Christen Broecker, the Deputy Director of AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, based in New York. Christen is also the Vice President of the UN NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief in New York. Since its origin, Jacob Blaustein Institute, or JBI, has conducted and supported original research and policy analyses of central issues in the field of international human rights to improve the protection of international human rights through the mechanisms and bodies of the United Nations. First, a short bit of history. As World War II neared its conclusion, President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to create a global organization through which the great powers could ensure peace and security. With his vision of a world founded on the 4 essential freedoms, Roosevelt was looking to avoid past American experience with the League of Nations, which the US Senate had refused to ratify. To enhance popular support, he and the State Department invited American NGOs to engage and enhance popular support and including Jacob Blaustein, the chair of the Executive Committee of the American Jewish Committee. He was crucial in promoting human rights in the founding document of the UN Charter. In March 1945, with his colleague, President Proskauer, Jacob Blaustein met with President Roosevelt and recalled that Jews had been the principal victims of Hitler's persecution and urged the creation of a commission on human rights that would draft an international bill of human rights. Jacob Blaustein Institute does focus on strengthening UN human rights and genocide prevention mechanisms, activities, and programs, as well as on UN initiatives to combat religious intolerance. So I'll start out welcoming you to the show, Christen, and asking about religious freedom and intolerance. First of all, we all see so many problems around the world, and you are very well aware of what happened to the Rohingya and also what is happening to other minorities from the Uyghur across the board. Almost on the anniversary of the Rohingya mass displacement in August, the UN General Assembly condemned violence and issued the first International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. And I know that Jacob Blaustein issued a statement on that. So I was wondering if you could say something just in general about the UN's work to confront this real threat of religion-based violence.
Well, thanks so much, Adam. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And I really appreciate your taking the time to recount some of JBI's history and origin. It really does, I think, make us a uniquely situated actor in the human rights field, because we are drawing from this legacy and this desire of the American Jewish Committee, but also the broader U.S. civil society community at large. I mean, the consultants to the San Francisco conference came from all parts of U.S. civil society, and it really was a testament to joint civil society advocacy that human rights was included in the UN Charter at all. Without civil society pressing the U.S. would not have pressed for its inclusion in the Charter like it did, and it very well might not have appeared. So it's, we were founded 50 years ago in 2021 in memory of Jacob Blaustein with the specific objective of trying to figure out how to help the UN realize that objective, that shared objective to promote human rights, but also to prevent something like the Holocaust from ever happening again. And it's a tragedy that we keep confronting situations like the genocide of the Rohingya. And we at JBI have worked very hard to try and spur the work of particularly the independent UN human rights mechanisms, but also the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and call for meaningful advocacy and then concerted action at the Human Rights Council to create the kinds of mechanisms that will force states to confront violations of physical integrity, sexual violence, the kinds of persecution that the Rohingya experienced and that so many other communities are experiencing around the world, albeit at a smaller scale. We were glad to see that the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly have been able to react to the situation confronting the Rohingya, and that they were able to establish a fact-finding mission. We saw the very important work of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, even before the establishment of that fact-finding mission. And we were pleased to see that states were able to create a day condemning victims of violence based on religion or belief as an opportunity for us to raise this case and so many others that for various reasons can't get the same kind of political traction and consensus at the UN at this time. I mean, I don't have to tell you which ones those are, but even the Rohingya situation is not being adequately addressed by the Security Council, as you well know, and we are continually pressing on every part of the UN system to try and change that dynamic or to make it more likely that the situation will get the attention it deserves.
You spoke about the role of civil society, of NGOs and even religious groups to keep these moral issues on the table in UN fora. I know that you all function basically as a think tank, correct me if I'm wrong, and you can convene a wide variety of players. You can issue reports. What's your general modus operandi or operandus at the UN?
Well, we aspire to be a think tank, and we do aspire to use our convening power in particular to bring people together. We have deep experience and history in the functioning and the work of UN human rights mechanisms and how those relate to the political bodies. I mean, for decades, the director of our institute served as a member of the UN Committee Against Torture, the treaty body, and prior to that, assisted on US public delegations to some of the UN meetings back when that used to be a practice. So we have had, I would say, I think a better than average ability to see how you can affect the calculus of governments and then key secretariat actors to bring about meaningful change in the kind of output you see from the UN on human rights issues. So we've been able to pull people together to take up issues like the relationship of human rights violations to the Commission of Genocide. We were able to convene a group of experts to work with the Office of the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Genocide Prevention and produce like a really meaningful guide to understanding how patterns of human rights violations can signal a risk of genocide. We've worked with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on exploring what their capacity has been to integrate human rights more systematically into the work of the rest of the UN system on the ground through different ways. The most, I think, recent of those would be through leadership of the Secretary General in what was called the Human Rights Upfront Initiative, and now is reflected in the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, which he issued early this year, just before the pandemic shut everything down, except for web series like these. And we've continued to try and bring thoughtful people together with those that are working inside international organizations to kind of make the machinery function more effectively.
Well, before we speak more about building consensus, I still wanted to look a little bit more on the range of challenges relating to religious intolerance. Sometimes on the part of states, sometimes they may be popular movements, but it's a rising trend, perhaps not a new thing, but the scale is very challenging, and sometimes the issue is religious or ethnic minorities. Sometimes the issue is immigrants, and I know that JBI has written to the U.S. government in deep concern regarding its policies, cutting back the number of asylum applicants or asylees. One hopes now we may see an opening of doors, cautious opening of doors. But as far as JBI's ability to interact with the U.S. government, I wonder if you could say something about that role.
Well, especially in the framework of religious intolerance, let me start there. We have pushed the U.S. to play a leading role in trying to bring about a constructive and consensus-based approach to combating religious intolerance through the UN in particular, but also more broadly. And that's been particularly important for the US to lead because the US has such a vested interest in ensuring that the consensus-based approach reflects the First Amendment, frankly, and that we can find ways of agreeing to combat religious intolerance worldwide that are sensitive to the importance of of maintaining respect for freedom of expression at the same time. So on the UN side, as you might know, this has been one of the most difficult areas to reach compromise among member states for decades. The question of how do we characterize what sorts of expressions of hostility are and are not offensive, what should be prohibited, what is permissible. And once we agree on that, how do we confront speech that's permissible, but yet not conducive to a tolerant society? We pressed the U.S. and we championed the U.S. decision to try and reach a compromise approach on what were called, for example, defamation of religions resolutions. And those came to an end back in 2011 after 10 years of a really divisive and toxic climate at the UN among member states about how to characterize this question of what to do about intolerant speech, whether criminalizing blasphemy, whether criminalizing hate speech broadly defined is an appropriate response to something that the state has targeted as being negative expression about religion. This compromise approach that was reached acknowledges that stereotyping is a problem, that dehumanizing speech is a problem, that people who are adherents of religions are rights holders who deserve to be protected, but at the same time, the right to freedom of expression needs to be safeguarded and can only be limited in situations that are set out in human rights law already. So this agreement series of resolutions brought an end to that hostility, brought an end to that confrontation at the political bodies, and it created space for the independent experts that work on the field of freedom of religion or belief to be able to take up their work with a lot more, I would say, vigor. So we were able to work even more constructively with the people who were serving as special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief because their mandates weren't held hostage to this fight. At the same time, the US government and the governments of Pakistan and the UK and Egypt and others agreed to hold a series of best practices meetings on combating religious intolerance periodically called Istanbul process meetings. And JBI has been a big player in that, and we've been pushing the US government specifically to engage constructively in those meetings, to, in its bilateral relationships, make it a priority for states around the world to come on board, and the idea of getting together to actually talk about what works. So those meetings have sometimes been, I would say, a pressure valve, a way for people to come together and fight about the issues on which we still disagree, but in a place that's more constructive, but also an opportunity to show what works, to bring examples from the AJC has drawn from its experience in working with communities that are subject to anti-Semitism, to allowing other groups in the countries that are hosting these meetings to attend and present examples from their own countries. The most recent of these meetings was held in the Netherlands in November of 2019. And that was a very interesting opportunity because not only did the Netherlands invite conversations about its own approach, right, in the area of combating anti-Muslim discrimination and anti-Semitism, but it also offered the opportunity, it put pressure on the Netherlands to allow Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shahid, to undertake a country visit prior to this meeting being held. It kind of created like interesting engagement between a Western country and a human rights mechanism, and at the same time, provided a forum for all of us who work on religious intolerance around the world to talk about it all around the world, in a setting where it was a little bit less confrontational than if it had been in the General Assembly. So how are we working with the US government? I mean, even right now, this issue is alive in the General Assembly. Like, there are negotiations on a new resolution on how to talk about safeguarding religious sites. And we've been engaged over the past several weeks, with trying to engage governments to maintain this consensus approach. This is occurring in an atmosphere in which there's a lot of polarization right now, particularly between some governments in Europe and in the Middle East about this question of what is the appropriate scope for criticism of religion. And that's bearing out a bit at the General Assembly. So we're encouraging the US government to recommit and actually be diplomatically active and engaged in trying to maintain a compromise approach. And one that recognizes that the UN is trying to help move the ball towards better protection of religious freedom through its initiatives like the plan of action that the Secretary General developed on combating hate speech, and the plan of action on safeguarding religious sites that the Secretary General developed last year. Those are all ways that we're hoping to take that forward at the UN. And you mentioned,
in places like France, where everyone is aware, there was some recent violent incidents. Teacher was killed, having to do with differing views of freedom, whether you should show cartoons that can be considered blasphemy, and so forth and so on. And so, in the world, there are different ways to look at these same issues, but unfortunately, instead of discussing them, people are, taking vigilante action and worse. So one question is, given these differences of perspectives, how universal are universal human rights? And of course, they're called universal, but really not everyone subscribes to that because they want that cultural filter. And so dealing with that question of universality, we've got the US government too, Secretary of State Pompeo having convened the committee or the commission on inalienable rights, right, with a number of religious leaders. And I know that JBI has been quite critical of this commission in saying that, in fact, it is undermining this universal aspect of international law. So I was wondering if maybe we need a little more background than I gave on this commission.
Well, so the Commission on Unalienable Rights, yes, it was convened by Secretary of State Pompeo. It's comprised of academics who re-examined essentially the human rights framework with relation in respect to America's founding documents. So they tried to identify what aspects of international human rights law are the most closely connected to U.S. founding principles, essentially. The fear that came out of this exercise was that this unjustifiably narrowed the frame with which the State Department was willing to champion human rights going forward. Because the report of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, it says a lot of positive things. It talks about the universality of human rights, but at the same time, it seemed to turn parts of a foundational UN document that the U.S. supported on human rights, which from 1993, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. And that's the document that really set out the post-Cold War understanding of the human rights framework as all human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and you can't pick and choose, essentially, which rights that you as a country are willing to endorse and which ones that you don't endorse. And this turning the Commission on Unalienable Rights suggests that the U.S. should view like quote unquote new rights claims skeptically, and that some new rights claims should be considered to be the articulation of political disputes rather than a claim that's rooted in a legitimate quest for human rights protection. Our concern was that the examples that the report gave when it was suggesting what sorts of new claims it was talking about, it seems to just be claims for rights from some historically marginalized groups of rights holders. So to the extent that it was women's rights advocates or LGBTQ advocates seeking protection from discrimination, or even racial minorities seeking affirmative action, that all of these things cannot be characterized as legitimate human rights claims, and that states should be able, in those sorts of circumstances, to pick and choose whether they would champion such rights holders in their foreign policy and otherwise.
Yeah, that seems to be the implication. Yeah.
Our objection obviously is that this turns the U.S. perspective like on its head. The U.S. was always pushing back against the cultural relativism argument when it was articulated at the U.S. because it so often is used as a justification for maintaining practices that justify the imposition of violence or discrimination against a group of people with reference to either a religious or a historical justification. And we think the human rights framework, as it is, leaves adequate space for states to balance and accommodate religious freedom with the right to non-discrimination and the right to equality. And that's something that we've urged the Trump administration to reconsider that aspect of the report in our comment. And we will continue to urge the next administration to take a different approach, one that kind of returns to that equality and non-discrimination framework.
Yeah, and hopefully we will see that change and not just a hierarchy of rights, right, the religious rights on top, but something that more complex and interrelated. So that reminds me, you are also on the NGO committee for freedom of religion and or belief. Is it and belief or belief?
Or.
Okay. So, yes, here we are. So here we are with.
I mean, you could have both, I suppose.
I hope
you're allowed to have one or the other. Yeah.
So this is a committee of NGOs that are active at the UN, and you have various events and discussions. Maybe if you could say something about it.
Well, the NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief is really a group that I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of, because it brings together groups that have an interest in human rights, and specifically the right to freedom of religion or belief at the United Nations. It's pretty self-explanatory from the title, but there's not like a barrier to entry except for a very small, like, nominal annual membership fee, and it provides an opportunity for groups that have, pretty different agendas and different focuses of their activities at the UN, but who really care about figuring out how to navigate these issues at the UN, with a space to speak to some of the most important stakeholders. So if we all want to hear, for example, from the administration, the incoming administration, about how they're going to approach these questions, it provides us with a forum to approach them and get one meeting together rather than everyone doing their own agenda separately. And we have a very good relationship with the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and he addresses us annually together with at least one other human rights mandate holder from the UN system. And that's been a really good opportunity to show how freedom of religion or belief issues that concern so many of our members are being taken up at other parts of the system, and where there are commonalities, and where, we can kind of take these discussions to other parts of the UN system. Like, for example, the screenshot that you just displayed was our most recent meeting with the Special Rapporteur on cultural rights, Karima Banoun, and her work on promoting cultural rights defenders. And her most recent report is on cultural rights and climate change. And it helps us think about some of the issues that we are confronting from a new angle. And that's helpful for all of us.
Yeah, cultural rights. I mean, from the Irish being forbidden to speak their own language or ride horses in the Irish style back, 300, 400 years ago, to now where the Rohingya, their culture of poetry and local folklore and all, not to mention the mosques and graveyards are all being destroyed. And so it's both intangible heritage and also monuments and whole villages and neighborhoods. So this cultural destruction is real. And then again, whose cultures are we forgetting? Indigenous people, and so forth. Sometimes there are whole areas that we are not really aware of. But as far as religious intolerance, it's a huge subject. And I'm sure religious literacy is also a complex issue, because you have some secular people who are rather clumsy in discussing religious matters, and perhaps even dismissive. And so allowing this NGO committee to include atheist groups, which I think it does, is really interesting, because it creates a necessary bridge.
And also because, but it's an area of such interest to groups that want to ensure that UN initiatives to promote freedom of religion or belief really do continue to promote the or belief aspect of that. The freedom of thought and conscience is sometimes left out of some of the more important intergovernmental debates, and making sure that, for example, the rapporteur is very sensitive to not allowing that to happen, I think is an important function that we all support. So it helps remind us to be on the lookout for that kind of vocabulary.
Well, the UN is huge, but the special rapporteurs are dealing with very small budgets. Do you think they have adequate staffing?
Absolutely not. So that's one of my other functions is, we care a lot about maintaining the human rights mechanisms more broadly, like it's the human rights treaty body system and the special procedures system. And we have JBI, we've happened to focus a lot in the last 2 to 3 years on the budget crisis that's facing the UN and its human rights mechanisms. The special procedures are operating on a shoestring. I mean, on the one hand, if they weren't working for free with only minimal staff support, there'd be greater barriers to entry to creating them, right? So, and maintaining them. And so they're their affordability is part of their allure. At the same time, you can't expect people to be able to fulfill the expectations that human rights advocates and victims of human rights violations place on them without support, and they don't currently have it. I think it's something that really needs to be front and center in discussions in the coming year about how to appropriately finance the UN. The treaty body system is another whole mess that is also in a financial crisis that needs attention immediately. But as we know, there are states that don't support the human rights activities at the UN, and it has become increasingly effective for them to take that fight to the budget committee, because that's the least transparent part of the UN. So it's those fights over money where you really start to see initiatives come under fire. So we're grateful that the High Commissioner's Office has tried to support the special procedures with voluntary contributions and other ways of helping them get their work done. And we hope that can continue.
If you could stay on for just another 10 minutes, we're going to take a 20-second break for station identification, and we'll be right back with more from UN This Week. Hi, it's Adam Carroll again with Christen Broecker joining us from AJC's JBI, Jacob Blaustein Institute. And thanks, we're talking about now building, consensus at the UN on human rights issues in general, as well as religious freedom. And there is a budget crisis. And yet, in the last decade or so, we have seen some of the agencies or offices like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR.
Thank
you.
UNE.
Yes, the New York office grow. And Andrew Gilmore until recently, and Craig and other people in that office, are doing great work. But I know that JBI has in the past had recommendations for that office about how they can more effectively reach all the sectors of the UN, sprawling mass that it is, and kind of mainstream human rights into a whole range of topics, whether they be development, humanitarian, peacekeeping, political, and so forth. So I was wondering, how do you guys try to encourage that kind of coordination?
Well, thank you. Yes, we have really strongly supported the growth of the presence of the Human Rights Office of the UN in New York, as opposed to in Geneva, where it's headquartered, right? More about 10 years ago or so, that you could count the number of people that were in New York doing human rights for the Secretariat on one hand. And now we've increased it by at least nearly tenfold. I think there's at least 50, close to 50 people there. That's still not a lot, but it's more than it was, headed by an Assistant Secretary General, now Ilse Brands-Karas, who came from previously serving on a human rights treaty body. So she really knows not just the political side of things, but she knows the ins and outs of how the human rights mechanisms work too. So hopefully we'll have a great advocate there. We have also realized, though, that the Human Rights Office can only be as effective as the Secretary General wants it to be. And so to that end, we've been directing a lot of our advocacy also up to the very top, to the UN Secretary General's office. And that's why I mentioned before there was this call to action for human rights issued by him in late February, I believe, of last year. And we were really glad to see that, because there had been concern that in the kind of climate that the Secretary General is currently operating in, human rights are more contested than ever. The champions of human rights, some of them, were less effective and less on board with the human rights agenda than they had been in the past. It's not a climate in which a bureaucrat advancing his own agenda is likely to find a lot of success. So despite those challenges, the Secretary General did come out firmly in support of the importance of the concept of human rights. And he's kind of reconfigured the UN system around the world in an important way, which is the Secretary General has responsibility for appointing the resident coordinators that work in the country offices of the UN around the world, where previously they had a development agenda. They were UNDP first and foremost. And that has the disadvantage of forcing the head UN presence in a country to see engagement primarily through the lens of facilitating cooperation with the government, right? As much as possible. And that can make raising human rights really difficult. And so
that was an issue in Burma, in fact, that the Gert Rosenthal report found.
Exactly. Yeah. The Rosenthal report is an extremely important product of all of the pressure that civil society have been placing on first on the fact-finding mission that sort of had the idea that they wanted this to happen, and then on the Secretary General to make it happen, and then to make it public. And now we continue to press that office to do follow-up reporting on what have they done in response to the Rosenthal report's recommendations on how to correct the UN's failure in Myanmar to respond appropriately to a growing human rights crisis. We hope that will never happen again. We want the UN system, the Human Rights Office is tiny compared to the major players in the UN system, and their field presence exists, but it's not to the same. They don't have the same leverage as others. And so persuading and convincing all parts of the UN system that human rights is part of their job description, that human rights information is relevant to them, and that they need to consider how to act on it and have it in their vision for how they see engagement with the country is important. And that's what we're hoping the Secretary General will continue to do. And at least we have an architecture on paper that suggests that is happening more than it did previously. And the challenge as always is then to make it actually happen in practice. And so that will just require continued civil society engagement with specific countries, and then with the leadership to really show us what they have accomplished and show us examples of UN staff who don't have human rights in their title, raising concerns about human rights with government officials at times when it matters the most. We've seen examples of this. I used to support the work of an expert on the Committee Against Torture, and the Committee Against Torture undertook the first ever review of Bangladesh. And just before the review, in the days before the review, we saw the UN resident coordinator in Bangladesh, issue a critical statement, constructive, yet acknowledging the serious problem and the need to improve policing practice, the need to address the commission of torture, the need to address the situation of the Rohingya, all of this in a statement that came from the top UN presence. It was really a collaborative example where that was written and had the permission of everyone from the Secretary General to the Human Rights Office. This was actually the UN coordinating about how to successfully engage the government of Bangladesh to do better on a critical human rights issue. And we'd love to see that replicated everywhere, and hopefully it can be.
Yeah. No, in Bangladesh, I see the government is not very happy with the pressure from the international community, which means maybe that it's working, that the pressure is being felt. We'll see.
No pressure definitely doesn't work. So maybe, it's better than nothing.
Some of the issues we've talked about today, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, both of which the Special Rapporteur for the Freedom of Religion or Belief has been working on. We submitted a report on Islamophobia in India, China, and Burma, but it's a global problem, and it exists in the United States, certainly. So does anti-Semitism, whether it's a minor, incident or really, truly bone-chilling and violent. And so, in the past, AJC and some of the Muslim American organizations like CAIR, C-A-I-R, have had disagreements, and there's always room for disagreements on Israel-Palestine. Just acknowledging that, how can we make common cause? Because we're compartmentalizing. You guys are doing great work, and so we really need to work together on these issues of common concern. So how do you see that moving forward? How do you see the kind of challenge of building alliances?
Well, thankfully, I have extremely impressive and inspiring AJC colleagues to serve as an example to me in that area. The AJC has developed a Muslim Jewish Advisory Council that works in partnership on domestic issues in the U.S. really effectively and in a way that I think is going to be driving some progressive change in this country, hopefully in the next administration. The one way you can see this playing out is in the joint support that they've both offered for the No Hate Act. I don't know if you're aware of that in Congress. It's a bill that would increase, it provides incentives and puts other measures in place to strengthen reporting of hate crimes. So, like one of the biggest problems, and this is true for, Dr. Shahid's report on anti-Semitism, it was groundbreaking for a number of reasons, but the most important part for us is how strong his recommendations are and how applicable most of his recommendations are to the situation of strengthening our ability to combat other forms of religious intolerance and hatred and discrimination. And one of the biggest things he identifies is the need for better reporting. Hate crimes reporting is just, underreporting is such a widespread phenomenon. In the U.S., so many jurisdictions don't report any hate crimes at all, to the national statistics. And if we can't understand the extent of the problem, then we can't design actions to combat it. And if we can't, and strengthening hate crimes reporting mechanisms also involves reaching out to communities and doing better community collaboration. And what we've seen is that in some places in the U.S., the efforts of local governments to reach out to Jewish communities and collaborate with them and strengthen confidence to facilitate more trust and better reporting of concerns has been really successful. And it's something that can be hopefully exported to other situations and strengthened to become more of a national phenomenon. We've taken the lessons that our colleagues have learned and explored and are advocating for here, and we've taken those to the international level, where we're calling for UN reporting to reflect the same kinds of recommendations. Not just better reporting, but also better training to be able to identify what religious intolerance looks like at all levels of society, to be able to understand community engagement and to really develop your strategies for combating religious intolerance together with the affected communities. It sounds like something so simple, but the extent to which it's not taking place, to which you're not seeing accurate reporting or genuine efforts to undertake it, is really, I think, striking and shows how much work there is to be done. But in the sense of coalition building, I think that there's an example here that shows that it's absolutely possible and needs to happen at a much more widespread rate in the months to come if we're going to get things done around here.
The link between hate and mass atrocities, is certainly reflected in the story of Jacob Blaustein when he, brought up the persecution of the Jews in Europe and was able to impact the UN and the world. So we are facing the challenge of stopping genocide, of trying to prevent genocide, but related to that task is remembering genocide. So I know coming up in January, there's the annual commemoration, January 28th.
28th.
Yeah. And so hopefully, we will.
Oh, I'm sorry, 27th. Let me not get
27th,
it wrong.
yes.
Yeah, live 27th. It's Wednesday, January 27th.
Thanks. And so, we'll certainly put out any news of events at the UN or elsewhere around that date. So any other thoughts? Because we have been running out of time, and wanted to thank you. Any last words?
Well, just to thank you and bringing it back to the initial comments we made about the importance of civil society. We need to continue educating people about the importance of telling our elected officials and international diplomats about how much human rights matters to us, because there won't be, without a constituency vocally supporting human rights attention at the UN and elsewhere, it won't happen. And it's a continual challenge, and one that I'm so glad that you're so engaged in taking on. So thanks very much for having me, and happy to contribute.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you, Christen. Christen Broecker, and this is Adam Carroll. See you next time. Thank you so much to Christen and to all the viewers. Please spread the word, and we'll see you next time.